Thank you, and good morning to you, Chairman Levin, Ranking Member Camp, and all the members of the Ways and Means Committee. I agree with your opening statements that we have a China problem. In the last 40 years, we've been in a world of globalization, with multinational corporations in the private sector becoming increasingly dominant economic actors, taking advantage of increasingly global capital markets and labor markets and consumer markets. And that's been a hallmark of what's allowed the United States and our allies in the developed world to grow. That world has changed in the last 21 months since the financial crisis and the recession. And we are seeing that the economies that are growing fastest and are looking strongest in the world today are not the free market economies, but are economies that I would define as state capitalist. Countries where the state is the principal economic actor and uses markets for ultimately political gain. Countries like Russia, countries like Saudi Arabia, but most importantly and relevantly today, the country that's going to be likely this year the world's second largest economy, China. And we are experiencing challenges with a system that in some ways is incompatible with a free market system. So I think the first thing we need to do is recognize that reality. A lot has changed in the course of the last 21 months. We are facing a China that increasingly does not need foreign capital for their growth. We are facing a China that has increasingly sophisticated technology, and they are seeking additional technology, but the technology that they seek is much more sophisticated, and many Western corporations are increasingly loath to bring it there because it's been borrowed in the past. And then finally, we're facing China, and I think this is a consensus among Chinese policy circles, that does not believe that it can rely on the West to buy their exports the way they have in the past. Now, given that in China a strong level of economic growth and consistent economic growth is required for the political survival of the Chinese regime, this reality poses a challenge. I think the Chinese government all agrees fundamentally on the way I just outlined how their needs have changed. And I think that they have some strategies in place to deal with that. The first strategy is to diversify their exports away from the West, more south-south, places like Brazil, much more to Asia. The second is this policy of indigenous innovation that we talk about, allowing the Chinese to maintain a larger share of profits for what they do manufacture in China. And the third is to develop and grow Chinese domestic demand. Now, all three of those things are big challenges for China to implement. They will not happen overnight, and they know that. And because all three will not happen overnight, and because it is possible that they will not be able to maintain the levels of growth with this changing strategy that they need to ensure social stability and therefore political survival, there is a bit of a fourth strategy. And that fourth strategy is to increasingly politically decouple from the United States. A lot of finger-pointing about the U.S. dollar not being capable of being the world's reserve currency. Meetings of the BRICS that China has been leading to talk about a new world order with different ways of formulating norms of international governance. All of this should concern the members of the committee. I agree with these concerns. But it is not as clear how to respond to them. A couple of points I want to make quickly. One is that in this environment, many multinational corporations will find themselves on the wrong side of the Chinese government. There's no question. Google was the first case that was public, but of course there are many others. CEO of Microsoft recently saying that China is not the future of Microsoft. India and Indonesia are a dramatic change in their policy, and we can go on with other corporations facing problems with intellectual property, with cybersecurity, with competition from state-owned and state-influenced enterprises. This has happened before. International oil corporations used to be able to go and put a straw in the ground and take out oil until those countries realized that they could develop their own state corporations.
Try to sum up, if you would.
Certainly. And so as a consequence, they had to adapt. In summary, I believe the West will have to adapt. The biggest thing that's happened in the last 21 months is that the U.S. economy has become considerably less powerful, and we've lost a fair amount of influence with China as a consequence. The best thing we can do to regain that influence, in my view, is to rebuild our competitiveness and rebuild our economy. I also agree that we need to coordinate much more closely with our allies, though in many cases they are less capable of doing that than they have been historically. And in summary, I think I would just point to the fact that this is very different from the Cold War. The relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was very simple. It was zero-sum. We wanted them to fail. We engaged in containment to keep them small. We did our best to undermine them by supporting democracy and opposition groups within their borders. And that, in part, helped to bring down the Soviet system. And with the exception of the Soviet regime, that was largely good for everybody. In the case of the relationship with China, there is a great amount of mutual indispensability between the two countries. But the problem the U.S. faces is that we are increasingly perceived as less indispensable to China than we have been historically. And the Chinese leadership is conservative and risk-averse. And that's causing a great deal of difficulty. It's adding to problems that we would have otherwise. My one-word response and what we need to do from a policy perspective is we need to regain our indispensability, both in reality and in the eyes of the Chinese government. With that, I will turn it. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you.